Hey y'all, this is Jeff. So in this episode, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm just going to fill you in on what's going on in the life of the Dialogue Doctor, in the life of this community, and things that have happened this week and are happening. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can get engaged. And then we're going to go into new terminology and things that you can use. So first, I just want to give some shout outs and some thank yous. I spoke at the Career Author Summit last week. It was amazing. I just want to say thank you to Jay Thorne and Zach Bohannon for putting that on, to Stephanie Bond and Dana Kay and Honore Corder and Christine Deigel and Alicia McCullough and all of the other amazing speakers that brought so much knowledge and insight to the gathering. It was incredible. And I learned a ton. I found it transformational for my fiction. I did a whole bonus episode on it last Wednesday. So you can subscribe to the Patreon and find that if you want more information about how it was transformational for me. So I'm very excited about what I learned there and putting it, and I've already been putting it into practice. It's great. I also have a Vela dropping this week on Thursday, which is exciting. So yeah, I just share that because I'm excited about it. And then this week, yesterday, I'm recording this on Sunday. Yesterday, I got to speak at the Vancouver Island Romance Writers Association. They had invited me to do a 5-hour workshop with them. And I thought, no one wants to listen to me for 5 hours. That's a lot of time with me. So I roped Sasha Black into it, who does the Rebel Author podcast. Sasha is absolutely amazing. And if you're not listening to the Rebel Author podcast, you should be. So I pulled Sasha into it. Sasha did the first 2.5 hours. I did the second 2.5 hours. Sasha talked about the different types of characters. She's got fantastic books on writing heroes, villains, and side characters. So she talked about that. And then I talked about building character voices and designing a cast of character voices to help engage your readers. And I just want to say thank you to the Vancouver Island Writers Association. It was amazing. Y'all seem like amazing writers, and I had a lot of fun. So that was great. And then today I got crazy sick. I was sick for like 6 hours, 6 or 7 hours, with a horrible, horrible case of food poisoning. So I don't know why I'm sharing that, besides just to tell you, if I seem a little more mellow tonight than I usually am, it's because I'm still kind of recovering from just being gross all day. Yeah, so that was my week. Hope your week was better. Well, I hope your week was as good as mine and then ended better than mine ended. Yeah, let's talk about how you can get involved in the community. So if you want to get involved in the community, because the Dialogue Doctor community is pretty amazing. This podcast drops on Monday, and the YouTube drops on Monday as well. Yeah, and I would love it if you'd go leave a review. Wherever you listen to this, go leave a review for us, because I've been told, I should be saying that more often, because that's how people find us, is through reviews. And I'm not very good at promoting myself or this community or the things that we do. So please go leave a review. But the podcast and the YouTube drop on Monday. And then on Tuesday, I write a newsletter Tuesday morning, comes out 6 a.m. Eastern time on Tuesday morning, that expounds upon and defines a little bit more of what I talk about on the podcast. So the newsletter is free, comes out Tuesday morning, and it just kind of breaks down like, hey, here's what we talked about. This week, we're going to go over a ton of terms in this podcast. So the newsletter is going to help us break down those terms a little bit, and you'll actually get to see it, which I think is helpful. After I hear somebody talk, to actually see what they're talking about is good. I'm also going to talk with a slide deck for today's podcast, and I'll drop that slide deck in the newsletter so you can have a copy of it, so you can think through it on your own. So that's the newsletter on Tuesday. And then if you subscribe to the Patreon, patreon.com/Jeff Elkins, or you can go to dialoguedoctor.com and click on the Patreon button. If you subscribe to the Patreon, you will also get a bonus episode that I do every Wednesday. The bonus episode sometimes talks about things we talked about on the podcast, and sometimes future casts to like things that are going to be going on. So for example, what I'm talking about today, the people that get the bonus episode have actually already heard twice, because they've heard me working it out 2 times and kind of how I'm figuring it out. because that's where I just give raw thoughts that I'm going through. So bonus episode happens on Tuesday. I'm sorry, happens on Wednesday for Patreon subscribers. If you subscribe to the Patreon, you also get an invite to our Slack group. The Slack group on Tuesdays. Slack group's great. They're fantastic. All authors who really want to improve their craft and are learning about dialogue. We're all learning about dialogue together in the Slack group. On Tuesday, we do a writing prompt together to help us practice. And then on Thursday, we do a editing prompt together. So that's the Dialogue Doctor experience. Monday podcast, Tuesday newsletter, Tuesday writing prompt in the Slack, Wednesday bonus episode, Thursday editing prompt in the Slack. I hope you'll get engaged with it. The community is amazing. And if all you're doing is listening to the podcast or watching the YouTube video, you're missing out, because there's other writers like you who also love dialogue that you could be participating with in this community and learning from one another. And, we're just better together. It's just the truth. We are better together than we are alone. So you don't have to go this alone. Come and jump in with us. All right. So this week, I want to talk about something that I've been talking to other authors about. I shared a brief, I kind of floated it in the Career Author Summit to see how it would land. I put it at the end of my talk to see hey, I wonder if I'm crazy or if this has any value. And it did have value. I had a lot of people talk to me about how helpful it was. And then I floated it. I also put it in the Vancouver Island Writers Association, Vancouver Island Writers Association talk. And again, some people ask about it afterwards, and it seemed to be really helpful. So I'm going to share it with y'all because I find that what I'm going to talk about today is language that I'm using more and more often. It's things that I'm talking about with authors more and more often. So we talk a lot in the Dialogue Doctor community about how story is actually an emotional journey. What we're doing when we're engaging with a story is we're going on this emotional journey. We're taking an emotional ride of ups and downs and peaks and valleys. I think about the Save the Cat format, which I love and used when I first started writing religiously. And I think about how that is just a description of an emotional journey that we're taking somebody on. I think that's why we focus so much on inciting incidents and conflicts and scenes, because that conflict, that inciting incident, demands an emotional response. So when we're writing, what we're doing is we're taking our reader on this emotional journey. Now, if you've been around for a while, you've probably seen me use a chart to talk about that emotional journey with authors. And I talk about this as a full book and as a scene. I call it the emotional flow chart. I've talked about how I got this from Kurt Vonnegut. He gave a talk on a dissertation he was doing. His dissertation was about charting the stories of cultures to compare and contrast how the different stories different cultures like. But what he was charting was the emotional engagement with the story. So he's got positive emotions on the bottom and negative emotions on the top. If you consider the vertical axis of this graph, there's positive on the top and negative on the bottom. And then the horizontal axis, so the through line of the graph, is the beats of the story or the beats of the scene. So I really connect with this and love this understanding of story and love this visualization of story. I find it really helpful as I think about the journey that I'm taking a reader on, to think about, how does this scene make that reader feel? And part of what I think is important is that I don't know that there is a correct way to do the chart. I don't think there's a formula to it where you can be oh, this is the winning story. I think what's important is the movement, right? That's why we're obsessed with conflict and inciting incidents, because we need emotional movement. in every scene and across the story. So if our story is a flat line on our emotional flow chart, it's super boring. I also don't think this is something that we can like do math to do. I think this is a gut instinct, because if we're going to tell the truth about our reader's engagement with the emotional flow of the story, the reader has a lot going on, right? They're bringing a lot of baggage into the story. Maybe they had a horrible day. Maybe they've had a horrible year. Maybe your book is about cancer and they had a friend die from cancer, right? Like maybe your book is a thriller about someone that starts off with someone in a car crash and your reader was once in a car crash, right? Like, so we can't actually math out the emotional journey with like statistical exactness, because we just don't know how our reader's going to emotionally respond to what we're writing. But what we can do is we can say like, hey, this is what I'm going for, right? When a reader reads the book, all things being equal, this is the journey I hope that they go on. That's what we can do. So, for example, if we're writing a like rags to riches feel good story, we're going to start low. We're going to start with the rags where things aren't going great. And then we're going to have some moments of optimism and some moments of defeat, and moments of optimism, and moments of defeat, and then a big moment of optimism, and then a crashing defeat at the dark night of the soul. And then we're going to rally and we're going to go all the way to the end, right? Where we go up high, and the reader ideally is going to end with a positive victory yell. Whenever I think of these rags to riches stories, I think of sports movies like Hoosiers, where you've got this, old basketball team that's in Indiana that's, small school, hasn't ever won anything. And they got a kid that's a great shot, but he's got like some emotional baggage, and they've got a coach that doesn't really get along with the parent fan base. And we get ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs. And, they win a game, and then a kid's stitches bust, and then they win another game. And then the assistant coach gets drunk, and like, it's just this ups and downs. And we get the dark night of the soul where it looks like everything's going to fall apart. And then in the end, they win and everybody runs out on court and celebrates. And it creates this emotional experience as a watcher of that story, where it keeps us gripped because of the movement of the story, right? Now, in writing, often we have a character that the story is connecting to. And my theory is that if we think of the ups and downs of the reader, that what the reader is actually responding to are the ups and downs of that lead character that they're following. Except those ups and downs for the lead character need to be a little bit more exaggerated, right? So the crushing defeat that your lead character feels is going to be worse on your lead character than on your reader, right? The big victory that your lead character feels is going to be worse on your is going to be more victorious for your lead character than it is for your reader. So in essence, the response of your reader is just muted to the response of your lead character. So if we want our reader to get super excited, we need our lead character to get super, super excited. And if we want our reader to get sad, we need our lead character to get super, super sad, right? Because our reader isn't actually experiencing it. So when we're talking a tragedy, if we want our reader to feel this like pain of going through that, we're going to start the story at a high on the chart, and we're going to end the story at a really low emotional point on the chart. We want we want our character to have bigger dips and feel deeper tragedy than we expect our reader to. And we want those victories to be bigger and then we expect our reader to, because the reader is emotionally engaged, but the reader isn't actually experiencing the moment, they're imagining it. So, which imagination is a powerful tool, especially for different readers, but we just need to understand that our characters' highs and lows are going to need to be a little bit bigger than the highs and lows we expect the reader to go through. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and summarize, because I started talking charts and I started talking graphs and I started talking non-math squiggly lines. And so let me just pause and summarize what's actually important. What's important in what I just said is that your story is an emotional journey that you're taking your reader on. And your reader is following characters through your story and connecting with them emotionally. And the reader is mimicking your character's emotional experience, sometimes, but not fully, meaning your reader's understanding is muted. Your reader's experience is muted in comparison to what your character is actually experiencing in the text. So your reader's on an emotional journey with one of your characters. Your character's highs and lows are bigger than your reader's highs and lows, but they do line up. So when things are going poorly for your character, your reader is going to feel that. When things are going really great for your character, your reader is going to feel that. We can't control what our reader feels, but we can have a game plan in mind. We can have some hopes of what they feel when they read the story. So in that come the terms that we typically use to describe the characters in our story. And this is actually why I'm doing this, because as I've talked to authors, we've tried to use these terms. As I've written my own stories, we've tried to use these terms, and they're just not sufficient. They're great when we're talking about plot and we're laying out the plot. But when we're talking about the emotional journey, these terms oftentimes get in the way. And, you know, the tool needs to fit the job. If you don't have the right tool for the job, go get a different tool, right? If you're putting screws into a wall and all you have is a hammer, don't try to put those screws in that wall with a hammer. Go get a screwdriver. So the reason I'm working on terms is because I need the right tool for the job to talk about emotional engagement and emotional flow in a story. So these are the terms that we've been using in the Dialogue Doctor community, and then I'm going to start moving away from it. And I think just as authors in general that we've been using. The first one is protagonist. And the shorthand that we use for protagonist is hero. And this is the principal character of the story, right? The problem with the word protagonist is that it has a certain meaning when we talk about plot, right? This is the character that we want to win, or the point of view character, or the character we see the most in the story, the characters we see the most in the story. And I'd like to say like, oh, well, this is the character that the emotional journey lines up with, but that's not always true, right? And sometimes there's multiple protagonists, and who the reader is lining up with may change. We might have a protagonist that the leader doesn't fully line up with emotionally. So I think about, we'll get into examples in a minute, but the protagonist, and of the four terms I'm about to go through, the protagonist is probably the one that we could just keep using, because it's the closest fit, because the emotional journey does connect directly with the point of view. Second term is antagonist or villain. So this is one that contends or opposes the protagonist. Now, this term is where things start to get rocky, because in essence, the antagonist is the bad guy and we want the reader to root against them. But that's not always, there's a lot of stories that don't have a bad guy. I think about romances with a love triangle where there's one choice or another choice. Neither of them are really bad guys. One choice might be better for the protagonist than the other choice, but that doesn't make them an antagonist, just makes them a better choice, right? Or I think about a lot of literary fiction that we read where the protagonists and the antagonists are messy, where the protagonist sometimes ends up being a pretty bad person and has major flaws, and the antagonists sometimes don't end up being that bad of a person. It just gets messy. So I struggle, and part of the reason I want to start using different terminology when we talk about the emotional flow of the story is I struggle with the gray areas of protagonist and antagonist, even though we want to make them black and white, because it just isn't, right? Complex characters are gray. Great villains have motivations that we understand and connect with, to quote Sasha Black in her book, How to Write Great Villains. I think that's what it's called. Just go look at Sasha Black on Amazon. The book's fantastic when it talks about villains. But when we talk about the emotional flow of the story, it might be that it's actually the antagonist that our reader is emotionally connecting to, right? I think about the Batman movies with Christian Bale, especially the second one where Heath Ledger is the Joker. I find myself emotionally connecting to the Joker a lot, which is a weird thing to say, but the performance is so powerful and the insanity is so clear, and the conversations as the antagonist that he has with people are so strong that, and the Batman character is so stoic and so lacking in emotion that on the emotional journey, it's a lot. The antagonist is driving it of the story. So these terms, these black and white terms, get complicated when we start talking about the emotional journey of a story, because it's not always that black and white. The next term that we tend to use is ally or friends. And these are the ones that are associated with the protagonist or the helper. And typically that has to do with the mission of the plot, right? Luke is on a mission to become, in Star Wars, to become a Jedi Knight and defeat the dark side. And so we put allies next to him, and Han and Chewie and Leia and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they're going to help him on his mission. In the emotional flow of the story, though, sometimes friends or allies in the mission are actually impeding the character's emotional growth or the character's emotional journey. So they might be helpful in the mission, they might be friends or allies with a protagonist, but when it comes to the protagonist's personal growth, they're actually a problem. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes, where an ally, a friend, or a family member, again, doesn't line up with the simple definition of that term. And when we use the term ally, we then have to explain that, like, well, they're a friend and they're an ally, but they're not actually an ally because they're holding the character back, but they are an ally because, you know, they're part of the character's group or like friend group. And like, I'm just tired of fighting with that term. So the final term we use is side character. And a side character appears briefly in the story. Now, I don't have any problem with side characters, but saying that they're a side character doesn't actually help us explain what we want them to do emotionally in the story and how we can utilize them strategically. So these are the 4 terms I want to get away with. I want to stop talking about when it comes to the emotionality of the story. Again, there's nothing wrong with these terms, especially when we're talking about plot or we're designing, like, what's the role in the mission of the story or the objective that the story is trying to accomplish. What are these terms doing? They're great for that. But when it comes to emotional flow, I end up spending a lot of time talking around them. So let's just stop using them. Let's use different tools. So the tools that I want to use are vehicle, engine, anchor, and hazard. You've probably heard me use these terms a little bit already, if you've been listening to the podcast. So the vehicle character or characters is the character in the scene or the story that we want the reader to connect with emotionally. It can change scene by scene, but typically it's going to go through the story, right? This is the character we're on the journey with. This is the character or the characters we're watching transform. So, you know, when I think of like some of the later Rick Riordan books in the Percy Jackson series, where he starts flipping point of view, you actually have several characters, vehicle characters. You have one reader emotional journey, but several vehicle characters taking that reader on that journey because the point of view continues to flip. So you're watching these different characters go through these different struggles and different changes. But all of the sum of those vehicles going on the emotional journey become one reader emotional journey, if that makes sense. So the vehicle character is the character in the scene are in the story that we want our reader to journey with. They're journeying with the vehicle character. Next to the vehicle character, we have engine characters. So the engine characters are the characters that are positively encouraging or influencing the vehicle. They are pushing the vehicle toward change and transformation. They are helping the vehicle drive in the story. So if you think about our flow chart, they are moving the vehicle in the direction we want it to go. Now, if we're doing the chart that goes high, that starts low and goes high, the rags to riches, then the engine character is encouraging the vehicle to go high. If we're doing the tragedy, where we're taking the character low, then the engine character is driving the poor negative transformation. So the engine character is helping the vehicle character go on their journey, right? Like, and in a positive story, the engine character is pushing the vehicle positive. In a tragedy, the engine character is probably going to lose because it keeps trying to encourage toward positive change, but this is a tragedy, so things are going to go poorly. So that's the engine character, encouraging positive transformation in our vehicle, usually bringing those usually around to empower those emotional highs. The anchor characters are bringing negative emotion to our vehicle. They are pulling our vehicle down, dragging our journey low. The anchor characters bring out the worst of our vehicle character. They encourage our vehicle character to go in the negative direction that we don't want to see our vehicle character change. So anchor characters tend to bring about moments that cause our reader negative emotions because we're watching the vehicle character struggle in those moments. Hazard characters, that fourth term I want to use, are big personalities that we throw into the middle of the emotional journey to force our character to move, to force our vehicle characters to respond. So a hazard in the road is something our vehicle characters have to swerve around. So they're big voices that causes our vehicle character to move. So let's go over those all one more time. The vehicle character is on a journey of change, right? And this is who our reader is going to emotionally attach to, the vehicle or the vehicles. The engine characters are helping our character and encouraging positive change, leading to positive upswings on our emotional flow chart. Our anchor characters are pulling our character toward the worst aspects of themselves, bringing about negative emotional change. And our hazard characters are thrown in the road in order to force our character to swerve, to cause moments of reflection, to cause moments of emotional impact, right? To cause moments where the emotions of the scene have to move because of this character's voice in the road. So those are the four terms. So what I want to do is break them down in 3 different movies and talk to you about why they're helpful and why protagonist, antagonist, and side character isn't really helpful. So let's first talk Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. And I'm going to think about the whole Lord of the Rings series that he wrote from beginning to end. So, and I'm just going to focus on one aspect of it because, again, Tolkien has multiple vehicle characters, right? He's got Frodo's journey as a vehicle character. And then we follow Strider / Aragorn as a vehicle character for a little bit, who personally I never really connected with his vehicle, but that's the intention, is that you connect with Strider / Aragorn. You have a spin with Gandalf as a vehicle character and Gandalf's struggle with the wizarding world. And you have a stint with Merry and Pippin as a vehicle pair and their struggle to come around. So, and you even get a small vehicle with Boromir and Faramir, the 2 brothers. They both get their own scenes where they are the vehicle characters. So right away, as we think about the series, we can see that like Protagonist isn't necessarily helpful when we start breaking down the emotional flow of a scene by who we want the reader to connect to. Because of all of those names I mentioned, you can really, I think, only defend Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragon as protagonists. Everybody else in that group would be allies at best or side characters. So all I'd say, I think talking about them as vehicles gives us a different tool to discuss a scene. Be like, who are you hoping the reader connects with in this scene? So, but all that to say, for this little illustration, I'm just going to focus on Frodo's vehicle. So we watch Frodo throughout the series of the books. We start the books with Frodo as a hobbit in the Shire in this small town where he's expected to farm and live a small life, and risk and adventure are thought of as negatively. We then go on a journey with him that's supposed to start small, where Gandalf gives him a ring and tells him to take it to this elf village. There's a wandering through the woods. There's getting trapped in a tree, which is a little weird. There's being hunted by these Nazgul things, demon type spirits that are hunting him down, that are, the spirits of ex-human kings. And then he finally makes it to the elf village, and then the bigger journey starts to Mordor to destroy the ring. And as we're on this vehicle, this transformation with our vehicle character, we watch him become a simple hobbit in the Shire who doesn't think much of himself, who is nervous and afraid, to struggling with the idea of power through the ring and desiring power and wanting power, but also understanding the danger of power, to finally this transformed hero that has saved the world and has experienced this grand adventure and now understands the simplicity of living in a different way, and understands the Shire in a different way, not loving the Shire because he is averse to risk and afraid, but loving the Shire for the simplicity that it brings in a world of chaos. So that's our vehicle transformation. And with Frodo as a reader, we go up and down a ton, right? Like Tolkien really takes us on this journey where we have high moments and low moments with Frodo, up to the very end where he has to throw the ring into the pit, and his inner battle with power almost gets the best of him. So engine character for Frodo is Sam. Sam is Frodo's engine voice. He's with Frodo from the beginning, and he's constantly encouraging Frodo toward positive change. He wants Frodo to be the best version that Frodo can be, and Sam is always pushing Frodo to become that version of himself. So something that's interesting about engine characters and vehicle characters, when the engine is done really well, the engine looks like and sounds like what we hope the vehicle will become. So often in reading the books, Sam shows the courage and bravery and determination that we really want Frodo to have. Sam will show the wisdom, like sparks of wisdom, that we see in Frodo at the end of the journey. Now, we don't follow Sam emotionally like we do Frodo. Sam is not the vehicle. He's the engine that shows us what Frodo might become and encourages Frodo toward a version of that. Frodo's not going to become exactly like Sam, but Sam's showing qualities that we want Frodo to have, right? So that's what our engine does. And our engine creates these victorious moments for the reader where the reader gets happy and excited about what's going on. In the trilogy, specifically for Frodo, there's Gollum as the anchor character. Gollum is constantly pulling Frodo to the worst side of himself. He's encouraging Frodo to take the power for himself, to own the ring for himself. He wants Frodo to, and really Gollum wants the ring for himself, but he encourages Frodo to become more self-obsessed. The interesting thing about anchor characters and vehicle characters is that anchor characters often look like the worst version of the vehicle character, especially when they're done well. And Gollum is a perfect example of this, because as the series goes on, we learn that Gollum was actually a Hobbit type character who used to be much like Frodo, but became obsessed with the ring and has become this creature that loves and cherishes the ring for his own benefit. Right. So Gollum is actually calling Frodo to the ring. And I think it's in book 2. There's a moment actually where Gollum and Frodo have conversations in which Frodo starts to sound like and speak like Gollum, right? This anchor character pulling our vehicle down to the worst version of themselves. Then we get hazard characters. There's so many hazard characters in Lord of the Rings. These are big, huge voices that force our character into decisions and into emotional moments. So I think the first huge hazard characters we get in Lord of the Rings are the Nazgul, these fallen kings who are now servants of the Dark One because of their obsession with power, the Rings of Power. And there's a moment where Frodo is running to the Elfin land, and they are chasing him down. And they're so big, they're so terrifying, right? They're just this larger than life evil. You couldn't write a whole book about them, right? Because they're too dark, they're too evil. They're not even necessarily, they're caricatures of something, right? They don't have these personalities that we can jump into. But they're great hazards, right? You throw them into a scene and all of a sudden everything gets emotionally crazy. The elves in the Lord of the Rings serve this purpose a lot too. When the elves show up, they're big and they're weird and they're these big personalities, and they throw these hazards in the way of our vehicle, that our vehicle's forced to make decisions and respond into what's going on. So hazards are these characters that have big, loud voices that our vehicle character has to swerve around. Engines, positive change. Anchors encourage negative change, and hazards are big, huge voices. Let's talk about a different story. If you're not familiar with Lord of the Rings, let's talk about Bridget Jones' Diary. Because I love it. Bridget Jones' Diary is fantastic. And 2, because it's just a different take. It's a very different story than Lord of the Rings. So in Bridget Jones' Diary, we have Bridget Jones, who starts the series as a smoking, cussing, unhappy with herself and with her weight and with the trajectory of her life. And she decides that she's going to turn it all around. She's not going to be single anymore, and she's going to give up all of her bad habits. Now, it's easy to think that this is a story about a woman improving herself in order to get a man, but I don't see it that way at all. I see it as a woman taking steps to create a life that she wants to have. And the man ends up being kind of a side part of that. It's part of what she's pursuing, but it is definitely not the journey that she is on. So just to be clear. So with Bridget Jones, we have her moving from this, person who's unhappy with herself to someone who is more confident in who she is. And she's the vehicle we're following, right? It's from her point of view. We're experiencing her losses and really inspired by her victories. And that's, we feel her highs and lows. Not as badly as she does, but we feel them with her. She has an engine character. Her engine character is Mark Darcy, right? And this is one of those places where like antagonist and protagonist and ally don't really help, right? Because Bridget Jones is definitely our protagonist, right? We're following her through. And then we're going to have two other characters, Mark Darcy and Daniel Cleaver. And they're like her love interests, potential love interests. Is Mark Darcy a protagonist or a hero? He's kind of a jerk, right? Like he's not the he's not the hero. He's not a white knight in shining armor, which is why that term protagonist or hero doesn't really help. He's not really an ally either, right? A lot of times he's making things more difficult. And Daniel Cleaver is a, manipulative, sex-charged womanizer. But he's not evil. He's not necessarily a bad guy. And Bridget is definitely making choices to be a part of his life. So that's where like words like protagonist and antagonist, when we start talking about the emotional flow of the story, really start to break down for us, because it's just not easy. It's just not an easy choice. So I see Mark Darcy as the engine. He's the one that's bringing positive moments of change in Bridget's life. Sometimes those moments of change come in conflict between the two of them, but he is the engine. And like with Sam and Frodo, Mark Darcy has characteristics that we really want Bridget to find in herself. He's very self-confident. We want Bridget to be self-confident. Mark Darcy is proud of who he is. We want Bridget to be proud of who she is. These things come out in his voice and the way he's not afraid to declare his opinion, right? And we want Bridget to not be afraid to declare her opinion. In fact, some of the biggest emotional victories in the story, those biggest emotional highs in the story, come when Bridget finally speaks her mind to someone like Mark Darcy and to other people who are holding her back or treating her poorly. So Mark Darcy becomes that engine that we want Bridget to model, that we want Bridget to be like, that's creating these positive victory moments in the story with Bridget. Daniel Cleaver, on the other hand, is the anchor character. Daniel Cleaver encourages the worst possible behaviors in Bridget. All of the things that she wants to get away from, he is encouraging her to continue, right? Smoking, self-consciousness, self-doubt around her appearance and who she is. He encourages all of those things, but he makes her feel good. And he seems to be what she wants, but his oversexed, dry voice pulls her down to low moments, right? So we can expect when Daniel Cleaver shows up in a scene that we're going to get sad as a reader, because Bridget's going to have a hard time. We also have hazard characters in Bridget Jones' Diary. In the movie, they're Tom, Jack, and Shaza. I can't remember her name. I think it's Shaza. And they are big voices. They're big, huge voices. Now, Tom is a big, huge voice in that he is loud and expressive. Shaza is a big, huge voice in that she's, very opinionated and big. And then Jude is a big, huge voice in that she's kind of mousy and weirdly introverted, right? So we've got these three big hazard characters. And when they show up, they're going to force our vehicle to have emotional moments and change and swerve around them. They're going to express their opinions loudly and be there. So again, just trying to think about story in a little bit different way, thinking about it as an emotional journey. We're in the Bridget Jones vehicle. We're watching Bridget Jones become the best version of herself. We've got Mark Darcy. When he shows up, he's the engine that empowers that positive version of Bridget that creates victories for our reader. We've got Daniel Cleaver that shows up that creates that negative feeling and pulls our vehicle low and creates that negative feeling for our reader. And then we've got our hazard characters that force change and swerving, right? And create those incidents that we love so much that cause us to go. So one more, let's talk about Beloved, right? This is a book that we did for the book club. It's actually our first book for the book club. And it too, as a book, has vehicle, engine, anchor, and hazard characters. So one of our vehicle characters because I would argue Beloved has two. It has both Sethi and Denver, but I'm just going to focus on Sethi, because in introducing these terms, focusing on multiple vehicles in a story is going to get really confusing. So maybe that's at a different moment. Maybe that's a second podcast. We could pull out the Rick Riordan books and go through like, okay, there's 5 vehicles in this one. So there's one vehicle in this one. It's Sethi. I'm sorry, there's 2 vehicles, but we're going to focus on one. We're going to focus on Sethi. She is a former slave who's had this massive tragedy in her life that haunts her as a ghost, and we follow her. And she's got a daughter named Denver. We follow her life through not just her escaping as a slave in her past, but also her journey with this ghost that represents this tragedy that she's had. So Sethi's our vehicle character. When Sethi is frustrated, the reader feels the frustration. When Sethi is scared, the reader feels that she's scared. When Sethi is down and experiencing tragedy, we're horrified. We're on this journey with Sethi. Sethi has an engine character, which is Paul D. Paul D wants Sethi to find community again. He's trying to help Sethi find community again. And when Paul D comes around, we know we're going to have some high moments. So, for example, when he first shows up and they're in Sethi's house and they're talking about what they went through and who Sethi is, and Sethi shows the tree on her back, Paul D embraces her for who she is and what happened, and in their shared pain. So Paul D is one of our engines who's pushing and pulling Sethi to be the best version of herself and bringing about these moments for our reader in which our reader feels the victory around Paul D. Our anchor character is Beloved. Denver's an interesting character. She becomes an anchor some too. She kind of flips to the dark side. In Sethi's journey, Denver becomes an anchor and an engine. She's complicated, and let's keep it simple because we're introducing new terms. So Beloved is our anchor character. She wants things to stay the same. She doesn't want anything to change. She wants, and so when she's around, we expect low moments, right? We expect pain to be revealed, and we expect hurt when Beloved's around. Sethi. Our hazard character is Sethi's grandmother, Baby Suggs. I think I'm getting her name wrong, but she's a big voice, right? From the very beginning of the book, when she only shows up on occasion, but when she shows up, change is expected, right? I think specifically about the time that Sethi goes out into the woods, into a clearing, and remembers her grandmother, mother, I don't remember. I'm getting lost in their relationship. Remembers the character preaching to the other escaped slaves, and just a big, huge voice that forces this emotional change. Or the first time we see her, she's dying in bed and she's asking Sethi to bring her something that's yellow. Again, just forcing this emotional moment, forcing this emotional change. This big voice, larger than life voice, would be tough to write a whole book about her because her voice is so big. It would be hard for a reader to go on an emotional journey with her because hard for the reader to connect with her. But great for our vehicle character because she forces our vehicle character to swerve around and respond to the moments that she's in. So vehicle, engine, anchors, and hazards. How do we compare those to protagonists, antagonists, allies, and side characters? Well, your protagonist is most likely going to be a vehicle, but they can also be an engine or an anchor, right? So I think about the book thief. The point of view character is death, but the vehicle character are actually the members of the family, specifically the little girl. And so in that sense, the protagonist is kind of an engine, right? Bringing positive feelings to the reader as he marvels at this family. I can't think of a protagonist that's an anchor. Our protagonists can't be hazards, right? Hazards and protagonists don't fit together because hazards are such big voices and big personalities that they would be hard to follow for a whole book. Part of me wonders if like Crime and Punishment has a hazard character as its protagonist. Um, and you know, that might be why it's hard to read. Anyway, might be hard to read because it's long. Anyway, love that book. So even though I don't sound like it, I love it. Antagonists can be vehicles. So like I said, right, that second Christian Bale Batman movie, the Joker is definitely a vehicle that we follow emotionally. So those antagonists can be vehicles. They can also be engines, right? Encouraging positive change in the protagonist, even though they're anti the protagonist's mission. When they show up, we can, if the protagonist and the antagonist are locked in a struggle and the protagonist wins, we feel like we can get that engine going as the antagonist that's bringing positive feelings to our protagonist in a scene. They can definitely be anchors, and antagonists can be hazards. You can go big with an antagonist voice and make them into that hazard thing that when they show up, they're causing our vehicle to swerve. I think about like mysteries and thrillers where you don't necessarily see the antagonist a lot. And when they show up, they're this big, huge voice. What comes to mind is the movie Roger Rabbit, where Christopher Lloyd is the antagonist. And man, he's got a big voice there at the end, especially. He's definitely a hazard character that's voicing this emotional response from our protagonist. So anyway, hazard characters, big emotional response. Then we can think of allies, right? Friends. They can be vehicles. We can follow the ally emotionally. Specifically, when I think of Harry Potter, you've got Ron and Hermione as allies. A lot of readers connect to Hermione over Harry. And Hermione becomes the vehicle in the scene that they're following. Allies can also be engines. Ron and Hermione in scenes serve as engines for Harry, which is good. Allies can be anchors. This happens in a lot of YA literature where the lead character's friends are actually hindrances to them. And their friends are constantly kind of encouraging them to stay the same. I might argue that in Beloved, Beloved is a ally. Technically, she's adopted as family and brought in. It's kind of a shady ally. Denver is definitely an ally to Sethi, Sethi's daughter, but Denver a lot of times serves as an anchor as well and pulls Sethi down into those negative emotions, especially when Paul D tries to connect with Sethi and Denver doesn't like it. So yeah, you get that ally character can also be an anchor voice that's creating these sad moments for our reader. And then allies can be hazards. You can go big with allies if you want to. Side characters cannot be vehicles because we don't see them enough to be on an emotional journey with them. They can be engines. They can, when they show up, they can create positive feelings. They can be anchors. When they show up, they can create negative feelings, and they can also be hazards. And I actually think side characters work best as hazards because if they're only going to show up once or twice or three times in a story and you want them to be memorable, go big with them. So yeah. So as we talk about the emotional journey, just to sum all of this up, I want us to diverge into talking about vehicles, engines, anchors, and hazards. And I say I want us to do it. The truth is, I'm just trying to provide tools that make writing easier. That's the goal. Can we do things that make our writing easier? Can we do things that make our editing and thinking about our writing easier and describing our writing easier? So if this language is helpful to you, if it makes things easier when you think about a scene you're writing, or you think about a story you're putting together, if it's helpful to ask rather who's the protagonist, if it's helpful to ask who's the vehicle that I want my reader to go on an emotional journey with, who's the engine that's going to bring positive transformation to my vehicle to give those positive emotional feelings, who's the anchor that's going to pull my vehicle into the negative and is going to bring those negative feelings from my reader. And then who are the hazard characters that are going to show up to force change? If that language is helpful, I hope you'll start using it to think about your stories. I know it's helpful to me, so I'm going to start using it more and more. All right, that's all I got for today. Go jump on to dialoguedoctor.com, get a part of that newsletter. I'll spell all this out in the newsletter again this week. Sometimes I think seeing it in text is better, and the slide deck that I've shared on the YouTube you'll get in the newsletter. And then also go and subscribe to the Patreon, get that bonus episode, and become part of the Slack community. Join us, be one of us. All right. I will talk to y'all again next week.